The United States is all in on Africa's future. Because when Africa succeeds, the United States succeeds. Quite frankly, the whole world succeeds as well.
We share the same spirit. We want to advance our common agenda with you and take our partnership to the next level in an inclusive approach, bringing together governments, the private sector, civil society.
As African leaders gathered in Washington last week, the Biden administration promised to invest billions of dollars in their country's economies in an effort to reset U.S.-Africa relations. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. With almost 50 African leaders gathering in Washington last week, the White House announced that the U.S. would commit $55 billion to Africa in economic, health, and security support over the next 3 years. The Biden administration hosted the first U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in 8 years, promising to build on the, quote, vital investments made by previous U.S. administrations. The U.S. president also expressed his support for the African Union, joining the group of 20 major economies.
Africa belongs in every room where global challenges are being discussed and in every institution where discussions are taking place.
With some of the fastest growing economies in the world, Africa is the youngest continent with a median age of 20 years and 60% of the population under the age of 25. Africa's rapidly changing demographics and the Russia-Ukraine conflict have renewed America's growing interest in the continent, which has become a key geopolitical player as the Biden administration seeks to reset relations with African nations. So how will power politics and America's strategic rivalry with China and Russia shape U.S.-Africa relations? Joining me now to discuss all this is Ghida Fraser, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 2005 to 2009. She's a former U.S. ambassador to South Africa. Ambassador Fraser, you headed the State Department's Bureau of African Affairs during the George W. Bush administration, before Africa seemed to drop off the radar of the United States. Why this renewed U.S. attention now?
Well, it's important. It's midway through the administration, and it's important. The Biden administration's officials have been going to Africa, but to have the summit really brings home the idea that the United States, with its launch of its new Africa strategy, President Biden's new Africa strategy, is ready to engage at the highest level of the administration. There hasn't been as many meetings between President Biden and his counterparts, African heads of state. But as I said, his cabinet ministers have been engaging Africa.
But is there a real strategy for Africa? How would you describe it?
Well, they've launched a strategy, but I think the strategy is wanting in many ways because it doesn't clearly prioritize. Their strategy is based on the idea of partnership with African countries and recognizing that Africa is important to solving global challenges, including like climate change, the fact that many of the minerals for a green economy are located in Africa for solar and renewables. And so they've tried to reposition Africa as key to solving global problems. But that said, there's still a lot of work that has to be done at the very highest level of the administration, i.e. President Biden himself, his national security advisor, and others, to engage African heads of state and to actually pull the private sector, the American private sector, more towards Africa, creating the incentives for investment.
But it does sound like a one-sided opportunistic strategy in many respects. You mentioned minerals, but how much of this sudden desire to reset ties with Africa also has to do with the war in Ukraine and the U.S. losing ground to its two key rivals, Russia and China?
Well, the idea of having a summit was preceded the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but certainly that invasion of Ukraine brought home the point of how important African countries are. They're 3/4 of the UN General Assembly membership. And so if you're going to have these General Assembly votes on global issues, geostrategic issues of importance to the United States, you have to have Africans on side. And so I don't think the summit itself was, they decided to have the summit because of that, but certainly it reemphasized the importance of Africa.
But is Africa, strategic importance, but is Africa then once again the theater of the new Cold War rivalry between the US, Russia, and China? Putting it bluntly, the US seems to be promising aid and investment in return for alignment on US policy.
Well, that's a good point. And there's obviously any country that is trying to develop bilateral relations or even regional relations with a continent or the countries within it is going to expect those interests to be mutual. And so it's not unfair or wrong for the United States to want to work with African countries that share its values, for example, in democracy, in free trade, in the respect for human rights. That is normal. That would happen whether there was China in Africa or Russia in Africa. But this
is a continent, Ambassador, of 55 African Union members. President Biden says he's all in on Africa's future, but is $55 billion in investments over a 3-year period for a continent this large, all in, when you compare it to the $105 billion in US aid for Ukraine for this year alone?
No, you're making a good point. I think that we can do far more, but I also think that African countries have to do the reforms in their countries to actually bring the private sector in, because the real money is not going to be government to government. It's getting private sector investment and our more robust trading relationships with African businesses. That's really where jobs are created. That's where money is made. It's the private sector. And so it's a two-way street. The United States can create incentives that will support its private sector to actually do more investment in Africa. But African countries also need to make the investment environment more attractive to American companies. And the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a big step in that direction because it creates larger markets. That balkanization of 55 countries, it means very, very tiny markets, and actually trying to do big deals which is what American companies want to do, is inhibited because of the fragmentation on the continent. And so it's a two-way street. We've got to work and they've got to work.
Well, it's a two-way street, but obviously Africa today has more options, has a lot of potential, but also more options than it did a decade or two ago when you were in office. Can the US now convince African nations that it seeks genuine partnership, not paternalism?
I think that, we've had fairly consistent relations with African countries across administrations, Republican and Democratic. If you go from the Clinton administration to the Bush to Obama, there was a lot of continuity. And even under Trump, there was continuity in our initiatives. The difference was the Trump administration was a big outlier in terms of not really engaging Africa and positioning it as a competition with China. That's an outlier. The Biden administration is returning to normal relations with Africa that has been seen in previous administrations. So I don't think it's a sudden engagement. It's a refocus of and a continuation of the engagement of the past, with the Trump administration being more of an outlier.
But is that part of the problem, the continuation of a certain approach that many Africans still seem to have a problem with? The fact that the US seems to dictate policy to African leaders rather than engage in genuine dialogue, that this is a one-sided conversation, that there is disrespect at the heart of it, with setting the agenda and telling Africans what to do. Has that changed?
There is a degree to which the policy can, and the tone of the policy can be perceived as paternalistic and truthfully paternalistic, but that's not unique to the United States. I mean, if you think about how people talk about Africa, they're always talking about we've got to do capacity building in Africa. Africa has everything it needs to thrive, to prosper. It has a population that's sufficiently educated. We all have to change our mindset, both in the West, in the East, And in Africa itself, why are Africans continuing to look outside of themselves for someone to come and provide something to them? It's unnecessary. Africa has the resources, it has the population, it has everything it needs. What it needs is the governance. And it's very difficult to talk about, as you said, 55 countries. They're different countries with different levels of governance, different levels of conflict, different levels of economic development. And so when we group the continent as a whole, we lose that specificity that's so necessary. But a country like South Africa, let's take, for example, should not be having energy problems right now. They should not have electricity problems. That's a problem of governance. The many African countries have been plagued by corruption. That's a reality.
Sure,
right.
but that doesn't, though, Ambassador, take away from the fact that there is this nagging sense among Africans that America is always in when it comes to reaping the benefits of Africa's resources, exploiting the African continent. Africa has the largest mineral reserves in the world. The DRC alone produces more than 70% of the world's cobalt.
Well, no, you see, we can't have it both ways. On the one hand, we say, oh, the United States is not investing, it's not engaging, American companies are ignoring Africa. Then on the other side, we say, oh, but the United States is, too much in there, it's militarizing the continent, it's stealing all its resources. No, we have to work together. And obviously the relationships will be adjusted as we move forward. We've learned that. I think that's where, this idea that somehow Africa is a victim of American engagement or Africa is a victim of American disengagement, I think is the wrong perspective. Africa has normal bilateral relationships. Now, this is African countries, because, we don't talk about necessarily United States engagement with all of Europe. We talk about United States engagement with France and England, which is very different, or Germany. We can be specific about the ways in which the United States is engaging. We need to be as specific about the ways the United States is engaging with African countries. Africa has to do what is in its own interests. And hopefully the United States in its approach to Africa will find mutual interests, and African countries will see that as well, which is, I think, the reason why so many heads of state came here to Washington, is because we do have longstanding mutual interests. It's not a new game here. We've been working with Africa for, centuries, decades, sometimes not so good and other times very well.
But some say it is a new game, though. It should be a new game with new rules of engagement.
Yeah, it should be. But those rules of engagement that need to be new are global rules of engagement. There needs to be a reform of the Security Council. Biden made that promise to African leaders when he came here about Africa having permanent seats on the Security Council. African countries need to be brought into the G20. He made the promise that the AU would have a permanent seat at the G20. Those global rules, the Bretton Woods rules, that came after World War II, when African countries were still colonized, they need to change to the global realities and challenges that we face today. There's no question. And Africa has to be a voice in stating what those no rules will be.
How important is it for the US to bring South Africa and some of the other major African countries closer to its orbit, at least on Russia, Ukraine?
Well, South Africa is very important to the United States because South Africa continues to play a major role in the African Union. It plays a major role in the Southern African Development Community in its sub-region. And it has a bit of a moral force because of President Mandela and others. So South Africa is extremely important. But the South Africans are still sore about the United States presumably being on the wrong side of history in terms of not pushing hard enough to get rid of the apartheid regime. It was seen as, opposing sanctions against the apartheid regime, particularly under President Reagan, when the U.S. Congress overrode his veto to actually put those sanctions in place. And so South Africa is a bit of a hard nut to crack. But that said, South Africa's values are much more aligned with the United States. It's a country that believes in democracy, civil society, the rule of law, the courts matter there. And so their values are far more aligned with us than, for instance, the other members of the BRICS, except for perhaps India and Brazil, but certainly those aren't the values that Russia or China hold. And so South Africa is in this funny place where its history is a burden to it in terms of its alignment with the West or its engagement with the West, but yet it's where it is and who it is and how it is, being a democratic country that respects the rule of law and human rights, puts it out of alignment with China and Russia, two of its major partners.
Ambassador Jendai Fraser, good to see you again after all these years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ghida. It's wonderful to see you as well.
The US-Africa Leaders Summit, which was held for the first time since 2014, coincides with the Biden administration's renewed push for a broad coalition behind Ukraine, one of Washington's top foreign policy priorities. At the UN last March, 26 African nations voted against or abstained on a resolution calling for the immediate withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine. Between 2017 and 2021, Russia has supplied 44% of Africa's arms imports, and many African countries rely on Russia for much of their wheat and fertilizers, while both Moscow and Washington continue to provide aid and assistance to African countries. U.S. investments in Africa remain far larger. China, meanwhile, has continued to invest heavily across the African continent, $735 billion at the end of 2020. Over the past decade, China has been Africa's largest trading partner, and since 2010 has overtaken the United States as the largest investor. African nations have also taken steps to move their countries away from foreign aid dependency with the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which went into effect last January and could potentially lift over 30 million people out of extreme poverty once it is fully implemented in 2030. It will become the world's largest free trade area, bringing together the 55 member states of the African Union, with a total population of over 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. So can Africa leverage its growing economic potential as the US seeks to reset ties with the continent's leaders after years of tense relations and neglect during the Trump administration? Joining me now is Tibor Nagy, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under President Trump. He also served as US Ambassador to Guinea and Ethiopia. Ambassador Nagy, you have said that the US-Africa Summit's success or failure will depend on follow-up actions. Did you see anything last week to suggest that this meeting with African leaders was any different from previous ones, that it was anything more than a photo op and business as usual?
Yes, absolutely. I was very happy with the outcome in that instead of just the 3-day, as you say, photo op, although some of the African leaders didn't get the photo ops they wanted with the president, but
they didn't get the bilateral meetings either.
Exactly. That to me was one of the negatives. But the positive is that Ambassador Johnny Carson, one of our most accomplished Africanists and experienced diplomats in Africa, has been appointed specifically to implement some of the outcomes from the meeting. So having somebody as accomplished as Ambassador Carson doing that, I think, is a phenomenal move on the part of the administration.
But looking at the way the summit went, do you get a sense that the US is finally treating African leaders, African nations, as genuine equal partners? Because there is this sense of grievance among many Africans.
Oh,
and this didn't happen, and it didn't happen overnight, of course.
Absolutely. There is a sense that Africa, in the scheme of things, is the lowest priority. And I'll be honest with you, I've said that in public speeches. For the U.S. geographic interests around the world, unfortunately, consistently, Africa has been in last place. Hopefully that'll change this century because of a number of factors, which we can discuss. But up to now, that has been the case, and it is up to the United States to absolutely prove that that is no longer true.
But how likely is that to happen? How easy will it be to convince African leaders and people that this isn't the case? How much of it has to do with the former administration's lack of interest, to put it mildly? Your former boss, Donald Trump, making disparaging statements that I can't repeat on air about African countries.
My first interview, I got that question, but
was his tone, was his lack of engagement a strategic mistake for the United States?
Here's the thing. I mean, even though, yes, there was a narrative in this summit that the previous administration had not engaged with Africa the way it should have, But interestingly, one of the key foundations that they're building on is Prosper Africa, which was started by the last administration. But you ask for proof.
But these are all wonderful slogans, and
Yeah,
we've heard
but
so many
actually visit-
from each administration.
Yeah.
It does seem a little self-serving to attempt a
Well,
reset now,
okay,
after all the
but-
advances that were made by Russia and China in Africa, let's
Yeah.
face it, in recent years.
Yeah, we have to do that, but we have to have high-ranking people visit Africa. But here's something else, and this goes to the heart of it. If U.S. embassies in Africa were resourced at the same level as U.S. embassies in Europe and Asia, that, I think, would show the Africans how seriously we take them. So that someone asking for a visa in Lagos, Nigeria, would not have to wait, 666 days. They could, have a visa appointment in a couple of weeks. So that, to me, is the real proof of, is the United States willing to spend the kind of resources on our presence in Africa as we do in other parts of the world?
But again, it's self-serving, isn't it? I mean, your former boss is the one who implemented travel bans, after all, immigration policies that affected so many in Africa. And look at the facts. The US's influence in the region has clearly receded. China's trade with Africa is 5 times what it is with the US. A recent survey, in fact, of young people in Africa showed that 77% of Africa's youth identified China as the most important partner for Africa's future, not the United States. I mean, the tide has clearly shifted. Is it too late for the US to be playing catch up now?
I'm not sure I agree with you that we have to play catch up. I mean, if you look, every single country in Africa, every morning people are lined up outside the US embassy wanting to come to America. And as far as I know, no one's held a gun to anybody's head to do that. Africans' first choice for universities, if they can come to the US for universities, that's where they want to come. So no,
but
it's absolutely
the US
not
is
too
no
late.
longer the US is no longer the indispensable and trusted partner for Africa, which is what you said it was up until recently. The US has lost its place, hasn't it? Not just as Africa's preferred trade partner, but has lost its place in Africa, hasn't it?
Trade is not everything. Absolutely, China is number one in trade. But here's the thing: the United States has contributed $100 billion to support African health systems since the year 2000. So when COVID comes along or Ebola comes along, that's what African states rely on, are the health systems that the US helped Africa with. There was an old line saying that America educates and medicates Africans so they can do deals with China. Unfortunately, to a certain extent, that is true. Because if you add the billions of dollars the US spends on humanitarian assistance, whenever there's a famine, guess who comes with the grain? Who is doing PEPFAR to help Africans recover from HIV/AIDS? Those kind of things you add to that.
You're looking at the relationship through the prism of superiority, as some
No,
Africans might
absolutely
say,
not.
and charity.
No.
Africa has far more to offer than the US is willing to give. Isn't that the truth?
Not charity at all. That's the one thing that America does not oppose. Americans necessarily don't like development assistance, but when there's a problem in the world, and it's not just in Africa, when there's a problem in the world, who steps forward more generously than anybody else?
All right. Ambassador Tibor Nagy, a great pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
In diplomacy, the importance and strength of bilateral relations is often measured by the number of presidential visits. For US-Africa relations, the record speaks volumes. Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Trump never set foot in Africa during their presidencies. Carter went to Egypt, Nigeria, and Liberia. George H.W. Bush and Joe Biden went to Egypt once. Combined, both Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Obama paid visits to only 13 African countries. Since Kennedy, US presidents have undertaken some 400 trips to foreign capitals, but only 26 were in Africa, if you exclude 14 visits to Egypt alone, owing chiefly to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When Obama convened the first US-Africa Leaders Summit focusing on trade, investment, and security, it took 1 year of preparations. Back then, US trade with Africa amounted to $85 billion. China-Africa trade was already $200 billion. Last year, China's trade with African nations reached $260 billion, 5 times more than the United States. Clearly, Obama's initiative didn't bear fruit. And so, in short, when another US-Africa summit was announced 5 months ago, it seemed like a hasty attempt to woo African leaders away from China and also from Russia, whose forays in several African countries is alarming the West. Washington felt the need to explain the summit had nothing to do with China or Russia, but have African leaders been convinced and swayed with a $55 billion pledge over 3 years, when a few weeks prior the Biden administration requested $38 billion for Ukraine, which, if appropriated by Congress, would bring U.S. assistance to one country alone to more than $100 billion in less than a year. Africa knows, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Washington, too, must know that the rules of the game have changed and that Africa today is well aware of its potential and options. That's all from me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.